When did people start smoking weed and other ancient oddities? Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back through time again. So, if you've brushed your teeth, adjusted your pillow just right, and turned your phone screen down low, let's get comfortably lost in some deeply uneventful history. Tonight's journey is about the quiet, smoky side of civilization. A story that begins with plants, boredom, and the eternal human urge to mildly alter reality. We're talking about ancient drugs, not in a party documentary kind of way, but in the soft, archaeological sense. You know, when everyone's dead, and all that's left is a charred pipe and a faint smell of regret. So, when did people start smoking weed? Well, the short answer is, long before anyone wrote down that they were smoking weed. But let's drift back to where the clues begin to rise from the dust. The ancient burnt offerings of relaxation around 2,500 years ago. In what's now Western China, archaeologists found a set of wooden bowls filled with burnt cannabis. They belonged to the Jirzhankal culture, a mysterious mountain people who, apparently, liked to light up at funerals. The bowls were discovered beside tombs, lined with pebbles, and still faintly sticky with resin. Tests showed that this wasn't just wild hemp for rope making, it had been specially bred for potency, which means, yes, people were getting high in the Himalayas, while the Roman Republic didn't even exist yet. It's comforting to know that while philosophers in Greece were debating the meaning of life, someone in Central Asia had already decided it meant take a deep breath and stare at the stars. Of course, cannabis wasn't new then. It had been cultivated for thousands of years, mostly for rope, cloth, and oil. But sometime, somewhere, someone looked at the plant and thought, what if I set it on fire and inhale the results? Human innovation is a wonderful, strange thing. Scythian steam baths and clouded judgment. Before the Chinese mountain tribes, there were the Scythians, nomadic horsemen of the Eurasian steppe. Herodotus, that wonderfully unreliable Greek historian, described how these people honored their dead. He wrote that after a burial, they would crawl into a small tent, throw hemp seeds onto hot stones, and shout for joy. That's one way to describe it. Others might call it a hot box funeral. Imagine the scene. A group of shaggy warriors, wrapped in furs, mourning and giggling simultaneously. No music, no lights, just steam, smoke, and possibly some light paranoia about whether the dead were judging them. It's both tragic and oddly cozy. Historians once doubted Herodotus. He tended to exaggerate, but in the 20th century, archaeologists unearthed Scythian burial mounds with, yes, hemp seeds and incense burners. Turns out, the old gossip wasn't making it up this time. So, long before modern dispensaries or reggae playlists, the Scythians were already there, combining grief, smoke, and maybe a few existential insights about horses. The great hemp divide cannabis spread like gossip through the ancient world, but it didn't always catch on in the same way. In China, it was medicine, ground into powders, brewed into teas, used to ease pain. The earliest known record is from Emperor Shen Nung's Pharmacopoeia. Around 2700 BCE, he supposedly tried every plant himself, which feels like an early version of For Science. He described cannabis as both healing and disorienting, which, yes, checks out. Meanwhile, in India, the plant took on a more divine role. It became bhang, a sacred drink made with milk, spices, and crushed cannabis leaves offered to Shiva. Shiva, of course, being the god who meditates on mountaintops and destroys the universe when he gets annoyed. So, naturally, his devotees thought it best to keep him calm. Bhang is still used today in religious festivals like Holi, a bright, chaotic day where color, laughter, and mild euphoria blur together. It's not quite the same as modern edibles, but the energy is familiar. The Greeks and Romans, oddly enough, were late to the party. They grew hemp for rope and sails, but didn't seem to care about smoking it, which is almost disappointing, considering how much they loved wine. Apparently, if it didn't come from a grape or a goat, it wasn't worth their time. Let's drift to Egypt. Egyptians had their own herbal experiments. They used blue lotus, a mild sedative flower often painted into tombs and temple walls. Its petals were steeped in wine to create a dreamy, floaty feeling, perfect for a civilization obsessed with the afterlife. It's unclear whether they used cannabis, too. Some mummies test positive for traces of it, but that might just mean the ancient world was generally smoky. Egyptians didn't leave behind weed journals, unfortunately. Just murals of people lounging with wine cups, musicians, and flowers, which might tell us everything we need to know anyway. Medieval morality and the return of boredom fast forward a few thousand years, after empires rose, fell, and composted themselves into history. Europe entered the medieval period, and as with most things, fun was suddenly frowned upon. Cannabis still grew across the continent, but it was once again treated as rope material, not recreational medicine. Monks spun it into cords for ship sails and monastery roofs, while peasants quietly boiled the seeds for soup. The church wasn't keen on mind-altering substances, unless they came in the form of wine, of course, because wine was fine. It was sacred. It was Jesus-adjacent. But smoke that made you giggle? That apparently was a gateway to moral collapse. Still, humans being humans, small pockets of people continued experimenting. Herbalists, healers, and anyone bored enough to question authority. The records are sparse, but every so often we find medieval punishments for herb misuse, a phrase that probably covered everything from witchcraft to recreational Tuesday afternoons. A colonial puff. When the age of exploration began, hemp became global cargo. Sailors carried it to every port, sometimes as fiber, sometimes as seed, occasionally as smoke. The Spanish brought it to the Americas in the 1500s. By the 1600s, English colonists in Jamestown were legally required to grow hemp, not for smoking, for rope and rigging. Still, one wonders, If you've ever been stuck in 17th century Virginia with mosquitoes the size of birds and sermons every Sunday, you might have looked at the hemp crop and thought, maybe just a little. Some indigenous tribes in the Americas already used similar plants for ceremony, but the global trade expanded their options. By the 18th century, cannabis had become a quiet, unacknowledged presence in the background of colonial life. The 19th century weed renaissance. Then came the 1800s, a golden age of medical quackery. Every apothecary shelf held tonics promising vigor, happiness, and occasionally death. Cannabis tinctures became fashionable in Victorian England and the United States. They were sold in elegant glass bottles, labeled with confident lies. Queen Victoria's physician reportedly prescribed cannabis to ease her menstrual cramps, which feels like a rare historical moment of empathy from a royal doctor. Writers, poets, and explorers all joined in. The French writer Baudelaire belonged to a group called the Club des Hachishans, the hashish eaters. They met in dim Parisian rooms, eating cannabis paste and trying to sound profound. Mostly, they just sat quietly, describing colors for hours. Even in India, under British rule, colonial officers began documenting cannabis use among locals with that particular British mix of fascination and disapproval. They produced long reports about how the natives indulged in bhang, as if that were somehow worse than drinking gin for breakfast the 20th century. From apothecaries to prohibition, then, of course, came the modern era, which means bureaucracy, panic, and moral overreaction. By the early 1900s, Western governments had decided that cannabis, once a respected medicine, was now a dangerous drug corrupting youth and jazz musicians, because, of course it was, America led the crusade. Banning it in 1937, most countries followed. Centuries of quiet use were swept away by decades of propaganda. The irony is that while empires had once used cannabis to weave sails, now they used it to weave fear. It took almost 100 years before public opinion began to shift again, before people started remembering that this was just a plant, one that had been with us since the dawn of fire, funerals, and curiosity. A soft landing. So when did people start smoking weed? Technically, as soon as they learned how to make fire and got bored. But more poetically, humans and cannabis have shared a slow, smoky dance for at least 5,000 years. From Scythian tents to Victorian parlors, from sacred rituals to college dorm rooms, it's always been about the same thing: finding a moment of quiet detachment from the world. If you've made it this far, congratulations! You're either dedicated, deeply relaxed, or both. Either way, tonight's story continues our gentle meander through royal misery. Because if you've ever felt bad about your own childhood, the missed sleepovers, the bad haircuts, the occasional awkward school photo, just remember, at least you weren't raised to rule a collapsing empire by people who believed hugs were unroyal. So if you're lying in bed right now, eyes heavy, mind wandering through ancient mountains and candlelit temples, maybe take comfort in knowing that someone, somewhere, thousands of years ago, was doing exactly the same thing, just with more hemp smoke and fewer streaming subscriptions. Let's drift now, gently, into the next story, another chapter of human oddity, and another royal who probably needed to chill out a bit more than they did. What happened to the people who built the pyramids after they were finished? The builders beneath the stones. Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back, about 45 centuries or so, to a place that's both impossibly old and oddly familiar, ancient Egypt, the land of gold and sand, of endless hieroglyphs and unblinking gods, and, of course, of pyramids, those massive, silent triangles that somehow manage to look both impossibly grand and deeply impractical. We've all seen them. We know they're old. We know they're big. We vaguely know that a lot of people had to move a lot of rocks a very long way to make them happen. But then what? What happened to those people? The men, and sometimes women, who cut the stones, hauled them, baked the bread, brewed the beer, stitched the linen, sharpened the copper tools. What happened when the last block was placed? When the pharaoh's body was finally sealed inside his eternal resting place? Did the workers simply go home? Did they get paid, promoted, buried alive to keep secrets? Or did they just disappear back into the dust, as if their years of labor had never existed? Let's drift back to find out. The story of Egypt's pyramid builders is, in many ways, the story of the first great labor force in recorded history. Before armies were standing, before cities were truly cities, there were pyramid builders. For centuries, people imagined that the pyramids were built by slaves, chains, whips, cruelty, and all. That idea stuck largely because of the Greeks. Herodotus, who visited Egypt around the 5th century BCE, which, to be fair, was already about 2,000 years after the pyramids were built, wrote that the Great Pyramid took 100,000 slaves 20 years to complete. It's a neat number. Round, memorable, deeply wrong, because archaeology has been quietly undoing that myth for decades now. In the 1990s, just south of the Great Pyramid, archaeologists uncovered something remarkable. A workers' village, an entire settlement of laborers. Their barracks, bakeries, breweries, tool workshops, even small tombs. They weren't chained. They weren't starved. They were fed, organized, and cared for by the standards of the Old Kingdom. Anyway, which tells us something rather important. The people who built the pyramids weren't slaves. They were citizens. Think of it as the world's first massive public works project. Egypt's rulers, the pharaohs of the 4th dynasty, needed a way to keep the Nile Valley's population busy during the months when the river flooded and farms lay underwater. So they did what rulers do best. They invented a spiritual justification for large-scale manual labor. Building a pyramid wasn't just construction, it was devotion. helping your god king ascend to the afterlife was a way to earn divine favor. Or, at the very least, extra beer. Records show that the workers were divided into teams, each named with the sort of humor you'd find in a very old pub. There was a team called the Drunkards of Menkaure, another, the Friends of Khufu. They competed against each other, carving their names into the stones they moved. Small, defiant marks of pride. This was labor, yes, but it was also identity. For many, it was the only chance they'd ever have to be remembered in stone. We know quite a lot about their lives, thanks to the sand's remarkable habit of preserving everything. Breadcrumbs, bone splinters, even graffiti. The builders ate well. Surprisingly well. Actually, their diet included beef, goat, fish, onions, and copious quantities of beer. Thousands of animal bones have been found near their village, suggesting a steady flow of meat to keep them fueled. Imagine it. Under the blazing sun, hundreds of men hauling 2-ton limestone blocks, pausing midday for a meal of grilled beef and bread, washed down with thick, yeasty beer. They weren't suffering in chains. They were the workforce behind a national obsession. But, of course, it wasn't easy. Archaeologists also found skeletons showing fractures, arthritis, and crushed vertebrae. The unmistakable wear of long years spent lifting the unliftable. These weren't weekend volunteers. They were seasonal workers, possibly drafted through a sort of labor tax, an obligation owed to the pharaoh. They'd come for months, then return to their villages when the flood receded and fields reappeared. And then, the next year, they'd come back again. The pyramid site was, in its way, a city, a temporary one, made of mud brick and dust, but still a city, with its own bakeries, breweries, doctors, and even cemeteries. When workers died, and many did, they weren't simply discarded. They were buried respectfully, close to the monuments they'd helped raise. Some of their graves were surprisingly elaborate. Wooden coffins, small offerings, pottery. Not the tombs of pharaohs, but not paupers' graves either. A gesture of gratitude, or perhaps superstition. Better to keep the builder's spirit close to the pyramid, just in case, because in the Egyptian worldview, building something eternal made you part of eternity, even if your name never got carved in cartouches. So, what did happen to them after the pyramids were finished? Well, the short answer is, they kept working. Because Egypt didn't stop building pyramids. Khufu's Great Pyramid was followed by his sons, Khafra's, and then by his grandsons, Menkaure's. Each generation wanted its own, slightly smaller, slightly less impressive triangle of glory. The first pyramid may have taken 2 decades. The whole dynasty's construction spree lasted nearly a century. So, for many families, pyramid building wasn't a one-off project. It was a trade, passed down from father to son. You might imagine a boy growing up near Giza, his father a stone dragger, his uncles masons, his mother baking bread for the crews. By the time he was old enough to work, the next pyramid would already be rising on the horizon. He'd spend his youth sweating in the sun, carving limestone, hauling sledges, cursing supervisors, and maybe leaving behind a few doodles of donkeys in the dust. And when that pyramid was done, he might move to the next royal site, or return to his farm. A man who'd helped raise a god's house. It's not glamorous, but for an ancient Egyptian, it was a life of purpose, something most people today would kill for. Now, not all pyramid builders were equal. At the top were skilled craftsmen and overseers, men who could read, measure, and cut. Below them were the seasonal laborers, doing the brute work. The craftsmen sometimes lived near the royal necropolis itself, in small houses of stone. They left behind inscriptions on their tombs, noting their titles: Inspector of Craftsmen, Servant of the Pyramid. Some of these tombs are shockingly close to those of nobles, a sign of respect that echoes down millennia. To the Egyptians, even the lowliest worker on a pyramid was part of something divine, because that's what pyramids were, cosmic engines. They weren't just tombs. They were stairways for the pharaoh's soul to ascend to the heavens, and if you helped build one, you were, in a small, dusty way, helping to maintain the universe. So, yes, they were workers, but also, in the eyes of their society, priests of stone. Let's drift a bit deeper to the inevitable ending. What happens when the last block is set? When the pharaoh dies, the rituals are done, and the site falls quiet? For the workforce, the great construction project would slowly dissolve. The temporary city would be dismantled, the tools set aside, the food stores emptied. Some workers likely stayed on for a while. Guards, priests, caretakers, all keeping watch over the king's eternal home. But most simply left. They returned to their villages, to farming, to fishing, their calloused hands turned back to plows instead of ropes. The sounds of chanting and hammering gave way to the hum of the Nile's fields. No fanfare, no pay parade, no final toast, just the quiet satisfaction or exhaustion of having done their part in something larger than themselves. Of course, the irony is that they built the most enduring structures in human history, and yet their own lives disappeared completely. Their names are mostly lost, save for the handful who scratched them into limestone. The friends of Khufu. The drunkards of Menkaura. They might not have known it at the time, but those little jokes, those scribbles, are the only reason we still remember them. When the last block was laid, they had no idea that tourists, 5,000 years later, would gaze up at their work and marvel. They probably didn't even expect it to last that long, but it did. And in a strange way, so did they. Their bones, buried in the shadow of their own handiwork, are still there, quiet, sun-bleached, but stubbornly present. Long after the kings they served, have had their mummies paraded through museums. The builders remain where they fell. So, what happened to the people who built the pyramids after they were finished? They went home. They aged. They died. Their children probably built more pyramids, and eventually, their world, that confident, God-filled world of divine kings and cosmic order, began to crumble. But for a brief, glittering century, they were part of something vast. They were the hands that made eternity tangible. And then they went back to their lives, because eternity, as it turns out, is built one exhausted day at a time. Soft pause. Let's drift a little further next time into what happened after the Pyramid Age ended. When Egypt's rulers started cutting corners, quite literally, and the grand tradition of stone triangles faded into memory. And what that meant for the people who once believed they were building eternity. What did people do with all the dead animals in old cities? The quiet corpses. Beneath the cobbles. Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a time before modern streets smelled of exhaust fumes and coffee. When they smelled, instead of hay, dung, and things that used to be alive. Because before the age of engines, cities ran on muscle. Horse muscle, ox muscle, dog muscle, sometimes, if you were particularly desperate. And muscle, of course, eventually stops working. So tonight's little bedtime journey isn't about kings or queens, or even people at all. It's about what happened after the horses fell, the cats froze, and the pigs simply stopped. What? In other words, did people do with all the dead animals in old cities? It's one of those questions we don't think to ask. History books talk about plagues and politics and cathedrals, but they rarely mention the quiet logistical nightmare that came with keeping thousands of animals alive. And then, inevitably, dealing with their remains. In a city like London around 1600, there were perhaps 200,000 people, and roughly 30,000 horses. That's one horse for every 7 people, each eating, drinking, sweating, and eventually dying within city limits. By the 18th century, that number doubled. By the 19th, it was worse still. And those are just the horses, not counting the pigs kept behind taverns, the dogs that roamed the alleys, or the chickens that never quite made it back to the coop. In short, medieval and early modern cities were alive with animals, and therefore they were also perpetually surrounded by death. When an animal died, you couldn't just leave it there, though, to be fair, people often did. There are records, in city ordinances, in diaries, even in sermons, complaining about carcasses blocking streets or floating lazily down rivers. A visitor to Paris in the 1300s described the carcasses of horses lying in the public way, corrupting the air with their stink. Another in 16th century London noted that a dead horse hath lain these 2 days by Ludgate, and none will take it away, though it offend all passengers. It's a small reminder that medieval sanitation was less a system and more a hopeful concept. So, what was supposed to happen to these dead animals? Well, ideally, there was a plan. Most large towns had a designated knacker, or renter of carrion, whose unenviable job was to collect animal corpses and turn them into something marginally useful. Word knacker still survives in British slang, meaning exhausted, and that's fitting, because knackers dealt with the most exhausted creatures of all. These men, and they were almost always men, were part scavenger, part butcher, part alchemist. They worked in small yards outside city walls, called knackers' yards or lay stalls, where carcasses were hauled, stripped, boiled, and rendered down into whatever could still be sold. Nothing was wasted if it could be helped. The hide became leather. The bones were boiled for glue. The fat was rendered into tallow for candles and soap. Even the hair could be used for upholstery or brushes. It was recycling, medieval style, efficient, profitable, and absolutely revolting. These places were not quiet, nor were they pleasant. Imagine a yard where horses are dragged in on ropes, the air thick with the smell of blood, ammonia, and hot fat, the ground sticky with centuries of animal residue. It was the smell that defined the outskirts of old cities, the same way car fumes do today. Writers complained about it. Constantly, officials pretended to regulate it, but everyone understood that someone had to do it because every day new carcasses appeared, and if the knackers didn't collect them, the dogs would. Stray dogs were the unofficial first responders of medieval sanitation. They cleaned the streets in the most literal sense, gnawing on anything remotely edible. A horse that collapsed in the road might be reduced to bones by dawn, its remains dragged away by scavengers with 4 legs or 2. There are accounts from London's plague years describing packs of dogs tearing at dead horses, while desperate people looked on, hungry, horrified, and grateful for the distraction. Sometimes the authorities would pay men to clear carcasses with carts. Other times, they'd simply shovel them into the Thames. The river, in those days, was the ultimate disposal system. It swallowed everything: waste, sewage, corpses of every description. It was the medieval equivalent of hitting delete. Still, cities were proud of their attempts at order. London had an official scavenger of the streets. Paris had the voirie, a department charged with removing dead animals. These workers didn't operate out of civic virtue. They made their money from resale. A dead horse wasn't trash. It was inventory. By the 1700s, some knackers grew wealthy, buying up carcasses by the dozen and selling rendered fat by the barrel. They even competed for contracts, outbidding one another for the right to collect London's dead horses. A reminder that, in every age, Someone is willing to turn decay into profit. But not all carcasses went through official hands. Many smaller animals, dogs, cats, goats, and chickens, were simply buried in back gardens, courtyards, or, rather more often, not buried at all. Domestic refuse pits, the archaeological gold mines of the Middle Ages, are full of animal bones, sometimes whole skeletons, sometimes just a skull tossed out with dinner scraps. Cats seem to have been especially disposable. So do pigs, at least the parts not eaten. And then, of course, there were the pit horses. Pit horses were the unsung laborers of mines and mills. Small, strong animals that worked underground or in machinery. They lived short, miserable lives, and when they died, they were often buried on site. Entire layers of earth beneath early industrial towns are laced with their bones, a silent fossil record of forgotten horsepower. In wealthier quarters, people tried to be tidier. In London's West End or Paris's Left Bank, you might pay to have a carcass carted off discreetly at night. In poorer districts, you just hoped the smell would fade. It usually didn't. Contemporary reports mention putrid mists rising from lay stalls in hot weather, spreading disease. People blamed miasma, bad air, and they weren't entirely wrong. Rotting animal matter does, after all, breed bacteria, flies, and despair. It's said that in 18th century Paris, you could locate the knackers district of Montfaucon from miles away by smell alone. Visitors described a mountain of bones higher than the walls of the city. Dogs prowled its edges. Crows circled overhead, and yet people lived nearby because someone always had to. But let's drift back earlier to the true medieval city. In the 13th and 14th centuries, the average European town was a cramped knot of wood, mud, and livestock. Animals weren't separate from urban life. They were urban life. Pigs wandered the streets. Goats nibbled laundry. Chickens nested under stairs. Every home was, in essence, a miniature barnyard. So when an animal died, it was personal. You didn't just lose transportation or milk or meat. You lost a companion, a worker, a piece of your household economy, and yet there was rarely time for sentiment. You dragged the carcass to the edge of town, dumped it in a ditch, or left it for the dogs. Life went on. Because it had to. The medieval city was a living organism. And like all living things, it shed cells constantly. Now, if you're wondering whether there were any laws about this, there were. Many cities banned dumping carcasses in rivers or streets. In theory. In practice, enforcement was rare, and fines were light. One London ordinance from the 14th century forbade butchers from throwing the filth of beasts into the Thames, under penalty of a small fine, roughly the cost of a cheap chicken, which tells you everything you need to know about how seriously it was taken. So, while the city fathers wrote laws, The rivers wrote their own obituary. And then there were the tanners, because if the knackers handled death, the tanners handled what came after. The skin. Tanning was one of the filthiest trades imaginable. It required animal hides, urine, dung, and weeks of soaking in foul-smelling pits. Whole neighborhoods reeked of it. So, of course, tanning districts were usually placed downstream of major cities, for reasons that must have seemed logical at the Eboued time. The result was a cascade of pollution that modern environmentalists could only describe as heroic. Rotting, animal waste flowed into rivers. Fish died. People drank the water anyway, and then they wondered why they kept getting sick. Naturally, they blamed the stars. Every so often, a reformer would appear, someone who decided that perhaps decaying animals and clean drinking water shouldn't mix. They'd issue new ordinances. They'd ban carcasses from city centers. They'd even build designated burial pits. And for a little while, things might improve until, inevitably, people forgot, or the pits filled up, or the knackers stopped showing up on time. Because the truth is, old cities never stopped producing death, and dealing with it never stopped being inconvenient. It wasn't malicious neglect. It was fatigue. People simply got used to it. Every so often, something extraordinary would happen. A winter so cold that carcasses froze solid in the streets, or a heat wave so brutal that they bloated and burst. Chroniclers record both, in tones of weary resignation. Life went on. Merchants stepped around them, children poked them with sticks, priests muttered blessings and looked away, and the cities kept breathing, inhaling life, exhaling decay. How did people fake their own deaths before modern ID? Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to a time before passports, fingerprints, or social security numbers. Back to an age when disappearing wasn't just possible, it was almost fashionable. Before modern identification, faking your death wasn't a high-tech con job. There were no dental records, no DNA, no grainy CCTV of your last known location. There was just rumor, paperwork that may or may not exist, and a surprising number of rivers for people to accidentally fall into. It was a simpler time. If you owed money, or accidentally insulted the wrong duke, or just wanted a fresh start, there was always one classic option. You could die, or at least appear to. So tonight, let's take a slow wander through the curious history of fake deaths. Centuries of vanishing acts performed by kings, peasants, monks, and the occasional bored noblewoman. It's a story full of imposters, miracles, bad disguises, and more returned from the dead announcements than any polite medieval society should have had to endure. So, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's drift back to the art of dying without actually doing it. Faking one's death has always required a delicate balance of planning, luck, and audacity. And before the modern world made identity official, that balance leaned heavily on audacity. In the Middle Ages, the paperwork surrounding death was flexible. If a person disappeared, and a few people swore they'd seen the body, that was often good enough. And if no one had seen it, well, there was always divine intervention to explain things. Bodies washed away by the river, bodies burned beyond recognition, bodies stolen by wolves, all perfectly valid excuses. It didn't take much to vanish. A horse ride to another town, a change of name, a new accent if you could. Manage one. That was it. You were reborn, just with worse hygiene. But let's start small, because not all fake deaths were royal conspiracies or political schemes. Some were just deeply unconvincing personal experiments in escapism. Take for example, the case of Martin Guerre, a 16th century French peasant whose story became so famous it was eventually turned into a movie. Martin vanished from his village one day, possibly after a marital argument involving bread theft, which is extremely French of him, and didn't return for years. Then, one day, a man claiming to be Martin Guerre walked back into town. He looked right. He spoke right. He even remembered private details of Martin's life. His wife, Bertrande, believed him. Everyone believed him. Until the real Martin Guerre showed up in court, very much alive, and probably very annoyed. The impostor, named Arnaud Dutil, was executed. Of course, because in 16th century France, impersonating a dead man was not a quirky hobby, but the real tragedy might be that he had been better at being Martin Guerre than Martin Guerre himself. Bertrande was genuinely fond of the impostor. It's one of history's quieter humiliations, being replaced so convincingly that your wife prefers the fake version. Though cases like that weren't rare. They just weren't usually so well documented in small communities. When someone died, the event was often certified by gossip more than fact. If a neighbor saw you fall into a river and no one saw you climb out, that was that. You were gone, even if you simply walked downstream and decided to live under a different name. It sounds improbable, but it happened constantly. Peasants fleeing debts, soldiers deserting their posts, monks breaking their vows, and in some cases, nobles trying to escape scandal or political disaster. And yes, the aristocrats always made it weirder. Let's drift over to England, late 12th century, where William the Marshal, Earl of Pembroke, one of the most famous knights of his time, reportedly faked his own death for a few days. Not to escape debt or duty, but to see how people would react. He wanted to know who would mourn him sincerely. It was, essentially, a medieval social experiment, or a petty test of friendship. According to legend, he lay in a darkened room, pretending to be on his deathbed, while his servants observed visitors' reactions. Those who didn't seem sufficiently sad were later removed from his will. It's perhaps the most passive-aggressive use of feigned death in history. Then there were the monks. Medieval monasteries were full of men who didn't actually want to be there. Some had been forced into holy orders by families who needed one fewer son to inherit the land, and a few simply left. But leaving a monastery wasn't as simple as packing a bag. You'd taken vows of obedience for life. Breaking them was both a crime and a sin. So, occasionally, monks would fake their deaths to escape. A robe left beside a riverbank, a borrowed skull from the ossuary, and suddenly Brother Thomas was called to God, while in reality he was selling fish in Bruges under the name Henri. It's hard to say how often it worked, but considering the number of saints' relics that were bones from random animals, medieval investigators weren't exactly forensic experts. The great royal fakers were, of course, in a league of their own. They had more to lose, but also far better resources for disappearing. Take King Sebastian of Portugal, who died in 1578 during the disastrous Battle of Alcácer Quibir. He led a crusade into Morocco and vanished in the chaos. No body was found, because of course it wasn't. And so began the legend of Sebastianism, the belief that he would one day return to save Portugal. It became a full-blown national obsession. Over the next few decades, 4 different men claimed to be the missing king. Each one appeared mysteriously, often with a beard and a dramatic story about captivity or divine revelation. Each one was eventually exposed as a fraud, and each one still managed to gain followers, because in a time before newspapers or photographs, he sort of looks like the king was a perfectly credible argument. One of the impostors was a poor bricklayer from Venice who had apparently convinced himself of his own story. He insisted he was King Sebastian and refused to admit otherwise even under interrogation. Chontadier, Inquisition eventually executed him, which was a fairly definitive way of ending the debate. But the legend lingered. Even centuries later, Portuguese peasants whispered that their king would return one day, just as soon as the fog rolled in from the sea, which is quite poetic, as long as you weren't the bricklayer. Of course, Europe wasn't the only place with vanishing rulers. Let's drift gently eastward, to Russia, where the art of pretending to be dead, or pretending to be someone who was dead, reached almost operatic levels. The most famous of these was False Dmitri, who appeared around 1604. He claimed to be the youngest son of Ivan the Terrible, supposedly murdered years earlier as a child. His story was that he'd miraculously escaped, lived in secret, and was now returning to reclaim his throne. And the remarkable thing? People believed him, powerful people. He gathered an army, marched on Moscow, and actually became Tsar. Briefly. Unfortunately, His reign ended when someone noticed he didn't actually resemble the real Dmitri, and his table manners were suspiciously Polish. He was thrown from power, killed, cremated, and had his ashes fired from a cannon back toward Poland, which, one must admit, is a rather theatrical epilogue, but even that wasn't the end of it. Two more false Dimitris appeared in the following years, each claiming to be the same miraculously. Resurrected prince. One was probably a peasant actor. The other might have been a disgruntled noble, and both were treated with varying degrees of cautious acceptance until their inevitable, and usually violent, demises. It became a kind of Russian tradition, like a very grim version of The Masked Singer. You might think these stories are all just relics of an ignorant past. But, in truth, faking one's death was easier than ever in the centuries before modern bureaucracy. You didn't need to fool everyone, you just needed to fool the right handful of people. A priest, a magistrate, a neighbor who'd sign your death record without looking too closely. And sometimes, you didn't even have to disappear physically. Just change names, or move a few towns over. Europe was full of little villages that never talked to each other, and unless you were particularly famous or had a distinctive limp, no one would ever know. That's why so many medieval criminals died in one place and lived comfortably in another. Records from England's assize rolls show that many convicted thieves or bandits mysteriously drowned while being transported, and yet, oddly enough, new outlaws with suspiciously similar names would soon appear a few counties away. It wasn't even scandalous. It was almost expected. The real challenge came for those who faked their deaths too well, because occasionally people would return years later, only to find that their lives had moved on without them. There's a haunting case from 14th century Italy. A merchant named Giovanni di Bologna disappeared during a trading voyage and was presumed dead after his ship was wrecked. His wife mourned him, held the appropriate masses, and eventually remarried. Years later, Giovanni returned, sunburned, penniless, but alive. And he was immediately arrested for bigamy, because, legally, he was dead. He'd been declared so by the courts. And now he was an impostor. In his own life, he had to prove he was himself through witness testimony and family scars. A slow, bureaucratic resurrection, so, in the end, the line between faking your death and actually being declared dead by accident was remarkably thin. One involved deception, the other, paperwork. How did medieval widows actually live, alone, but not free? Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a time when life was short. Marriage was a contract, and death was a fairly reliable way out of both. Yes, tonight, we're talking about widows, specifically medieval widows. Those soft-shoed, veil-wrapped figures you've seen in manuscripts, usually drawn as pale, pious, and quietly tragic. But as with most things medieval, the truth was a little less poetic and a lot more bureaucratic. Because, while poets wrote about mourning, the law wrote about property. And if you were a woman in the Middle Ages, your husband's death didn't just make you a widow. It made you a legal anomaly. Neither daughter nor wife, neither nun nor queen. You slipped into a strange gray zone, where your fate depended entirely on the men still living, and how much land they thought you might be hiding. So, let's dim the lights, get comfortable, and drift back to the world of medieval widowhood, a world of veils, lawsuits, and a surprising amount of strategic weeping. Let's start with the basics. Marriage in the Middle Ages wasn't really about love. It was about property, alliances, and fertility. You didn't marry for affection. You married for acreage. A good marriage contract could bind families together for generations, or spark small wars if it went wrong. So when a husband died, his widow wasn't simply a grieving spouse. She was a walking estate dispute. If she was lucky, and lucky is doing a lot of work here, she had a dowry written down, and maybe a clause granting her a dower. 1/3 of her husband's lands or income for life. If she wasn't lucky, she'd be told to pack her things before the body cooled. Because medieval law, for all its pomp and parchment, boiled down to one basic principle. Women were useful as long as they were attached to a man. Once they weren't, people got nervous. A widow with property was, frankly, a problem. She was independent. She could make decisions. She could, horrifyingly, say no, which is why almost every legal system in medieval Europe immediately tried to marry her off again. In England, widows of nobles often became bargaining chips. The king himself claimed the right to dispose of noble widows in marriage, which sounds romantic, until you realize dispose was a legal term. A wealthy widow might be forced to marry one of the king's favorites, or pay him handsomely for the privilege of not marrying anyone. This was known as fines for not remarrying. Essentially, you paid a royal ransom for your own solitude. It was, in a bleakly bureaucratic way, a tax on loneliness. And yet, some women managed to turn that loneliness into power. Take, for instance, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Yes, that Eleanor, Duchess, Queen of France, Queen of England, and general chaos magnate of the 12th century. When her first husband, Louis VII of France, decided she was too worldly and perhaps too outspoken, he had their marriage annulled. Within weeks, she remarried the future Henry II of England. But later in life, when she was widowed again, Eleanor didn't rush into another royal match. She ruled her duchy, corresponded with popes, managed rebellions, and arranged dynastic marriages for her children. She became, in short, the most powerful widow in Europe. But for every Eleanor, there were hundreds of women whose widowhood looked very different. The average medieval widow was not a duchess. She was a farmer's wife, or a merchant's widow, or a servant whose husband had died in a plague year. For her, widowhood was less about strategy and more about survival. If she lived in a town, she might keep running her husband's business. Medieval guilds, surprisingly, often allowed widows to carry on the family trade, as long as they didn't remarry. A widow could brew ale, sell cloth, mend shoes, or run a small inn, all under the legal fiction that she was still doing it on behalf of her late husband. Once she remarried, those rights usually vanished, because then, of course, her new husband took control. So, many working widows simply didn't remarry. It wasn't necessarily because they were mourning their lost loves, though some certainly did. It was because, for the first time in their lives, they were technically free. And that was a strange, fragile kind of freedom. Medieval society wasn't designed for single women. You couldn't vote, you couldn't hold most offices, and you couldn't be trusted not to go mad or bewitch the neighbors if left unsupervised. But if you were a widow, older, socially respectable, with a bit of money or land, you slipped under the radar. No one expected you to remarry if you were beyond childbearing age. You could live quietly, pray, supervise servants, donate to a convent, and occasionally make very pointed remarks about your late husband's moral failings. Some widows became benefactors of monasteries. Others founded hospitals or almshouses. A few turned their homes into informal refuges for other women. Something halfway between a guest house and a convent. You might call it early retirement, medieval edition. Of course, not every widow wanted peace and quiet. Some took advantage of their new autonomy in spectacularly inconvenient ways. Take Alice Perrers, for example. She was the mistress of King Edward III of England, not technically a widow when she rose to fame, but one later on. After Edward's death, she lost her influence overnight, accused of manipulating the aging king and profiting from royal favor. Alice's crime wasn't corruption. Everyone in court was corrupt, but independence. She'd made her own fortune, owned her own property, and worst of all, refused to fade away when her usefulness ended. The chroniclers hated her for it. One called her the shameless woman who was the ruin of the realm, which, translated from monkish Latin, probably meant she bought her own jewelry. But there were quieter rebellions, too. In small villages across Europe, widows often ran their own households. They could hire servants, lend money, and sue neighbors over property disputes. All things married women couldn't legally do. There are court records from 14th century England showing widows suing tenants for unpaid rent, or taking relatives to court over stolen sheep. They were often described as troublesome, which is usually code for refuse to be poor. And despite the constant suspicion cast on them, many widows thrived. They became midwives, healers, herbalists, the people others went to in times of trouble. The church might frown on them, the village might gossip, but they quietly stitched the social fabric back together, one poultice at a time. Still, independence had its price, because as soon as something went wrong, a bad harvest, a fire, a case of unexplained illness, the convenient target was often the same, the solitary widow, too independent, too mouthy, too fond of cats. By the late Middle Ages, these women were precisely the kind who got accused of witchcraft, not because they actually did anything sinister, but because they lived outside the usual structures of male control. A widow with no man to defend her could be slandered, fined, or worse. And since most couldn't afford legal defense, the rumors often stuck. It was, in a bleak way, safer to remarry, even badly, than to live too visibly alone. And yet, widowhood never lost its odd allure. In literature, widows were everywhere, part saint, part temptation. They were the melancholy figures in mourning veils, praying for their husbands' souls while quietly planning their next moves. In medieval romance tales, the widow was often cleverer than anyone else, worldly, experienced, and immune to the usual chivalric nonsense. She'd sigh politely at nights, and then outsmart them in verse. Chaucer, of course, had opinions. In the Canterbury Tales, he gives us the wife of Bath, 5 times married and thoroughly unrepentant. She isn't technically a widow, but she embodies the idea, a woman who's seen it all, lost it all, and refuses to apologize for living comfortably afterward. And that terrified people, because a widow, especially a wealthy one, was proof that a woman could survive, even thrive, without a man, and that, in the medieval imagination, bordered on witchcraft. So what was daily life like, really? Well, quieter, slower, and more uncertain than the myths suggest. Morning prayers, letters to lawyers about land disputes, a small household, perhaps a maid or two, occasional visits from meddling relatives, meals taken in silence, unless she had guests, evenings spent sewing or reading psalms by candlelight, nights spent in the wide, cold bed of someone who was never coming back. She might wear black for a year, or for life. She might keep her husband's signet ring, or sell it for bread. She might sponsor a new altar at the parish church in his name, partly out of love, partly out of guilt, and partly as an insurance policy for the afterlife. Widowhood was half freedom, half exile. You were both respected and feared, a reminder of death's reach and of women's endurance. So yes, medieval widows lived. They managed farms. They brewed ale. They buried husbands and outlived sons. They were gossiped about, taxed, courted, and sometimes burned. They prayed, schemed, comforted, and complained. They were, in other words, very much alive. And though history has mostly left them in the margins, anonymous, veiled, and silent, the fragments we have show something rare for the Middle Ages, women negotiating their own place in the world, one legal clause at a time. They may not have been free in the modern sense, but compared to what came before, they were freer than most ever got to be. What did executioners do when there were no executions? Hey everyone, tonight, we're drifting back to a time when the sharp edge of an axe was as much a symbol of justice as a crown or a cross. A time when cities had official executioners, men whose job was to carry out the dirty work of kings, dukes, and very angry town councils. But tonight, we're not focusing on the beheadings, the gallows, or the swordsmanship. We're not here for the drama. We're here for the in-between days, because, surprisingly, there were a lot of them. Most executioners weren't busy very often, even in the bloodier corners of medieval Europe. Public executions didn't happen every week. Some years, they hardly happened at all. So, what did these men do when there was no one to kill? Well, that's where the story gets interesting. Because when you give someone the job of professional death-bringer, but no one to execute, they tend to improvise. And the result is one of the strangest, most melancholy professions in history, half butcher, half pariah, half municipal handyman. Yes, that's three halves, but it fits. Executioners were never quite whole people in the eyes of medieval society. So, settle in, get comfortable, and let's drift through the quieter side of the scaffold. Executioners were official employees. They were hired by towns or monarchs, and they received regular pay. This was partly because no one wanted to volunteer. In fact, most executioners didn't choose the job at all. It was often inherited, passed down like a cursed family heirloom. If your father was an executioner, your career prospects were basically limited to executioner or village outcast. Occasionally, a criminal who faced hanging could avoid it by agreeing to take the job. This was called becoming the hangman's apprentice, which sounds rather Dickensian, but was a real legal option in many regions, a kind of grim job placement program, and once you accepted, you were trapped. Because executioners were needed, desperately, but no one wanted to know them. They lived on the literal edge of society, usually in houses just outside the city. Walls. Sometimes their property was called the Hangman's Hill, which is exactly as charming as it sounds. They had to wear specific clothing to identify themselves. They couldn't enter certain churches, and most people wouldn't touch them, because they were considered ritually polluted. In some towns, bakers refused to sell them bread unless they left the money on the doorstep and walked away first. So, when there were no executions to perform, what did these men do? They survived however they could, often in ways that blurred the lines between medicine, manual labor, and mild horror. One of the most common side jobs for executioners was treating wounds. Strange, right? But it made sense. They knew anatomy better than almost anyone else. They knew how to cut flesh cleanly, how to stop bleeding, how to work fast, and more importantly, They had access to things no one else did. Human remains. Many executioners became a sort of unofficial surgeon for the poor. They pulled teeth. They set broken bones. They brewed salves and ointments, some of which allegedly contained powdered human fat. That sounds ghastly now, but at the time, human fat, known as mumia, was considered medicinal. It was collected from the bodies of executed criminals and used in balms to treat pain. And who, you might wonder, was in charge of collecting it? Yes, the executioner. So in the lull between hangings, he might be in his workshop, boiling fat, drying blood, or preparing tinctures. A quiet day at the office. They also worked as animal skinners and tanners, because killing things cleanly and efficiently was, after all, a transferable skill. In many towns, the executioner held a monopoly on disposing of dead animals. If your horse died, or your cow fell into the well, you didn't call the priest. You called the hangman. It was dirty work, but it paid, and it reinforced the strange role of the executioner. Part civic servant, part scapegoat. They did what no one else wanted to do. They handled death so others didn't have to. In some places, they even ran small businesses, slaughterhouses, tanneries, or apothecaries, but their social status didn't improve. Even when people needed them, they still crossed the street to avoid them. There's something eerily sad about the way medieval society treated its executioners. They were essential, but also untouchable. They could save your life one day, and you'd still refuse to share a drink with them the next. It created this peculiar double life. Executioners became both feared and pitied, wealthy and despised. In some records, they're described as dressing richly, wearing gold chains, even keeping servants. And yet, they weren't allowed to enter certain guilds or marry outside their own families. Whole dynasties of hangmen emerged, the most famous being the Franz Schmidt family of Nuremberg. Franz Schmidt, the city executioner from 1578 to 1617, kept meticulous diaries of his work. They survive to this day, and they're fascinating in their calm precision. Over his 40-year career, Schmidt executed 394 people, but also performed hundreds of medical treatments. He recorded them all, removed arrowhead from man's arm, set a woman's broken jaw, applied balm to ulcer. It's like reading the journal of someone who couldn't decide whether he was a healer or a destroyer. When there were no executions, Schmidt lived quietly with his wife and children. He went to church, in the back pew, of course, and corresponded politely with local officials. He saw his work as duty, not cruelty. He believed that by killing quickly and humanely, he was serving both God and society, which, in a grim way, was true. And when he finally retired, the city actually granted him full citizenship, a huge honor for someone of his profession. He opened a medical practice and died respected, though still slightly feared. His descendants became doctors, judges, and professors, the respectable versions of what he'd always been. But Franz Schmidt was the exception. Most executioners didn't leave diaries. They left rumors, stories, whispered about their strange habits and midnight errands. 1 tale from 15th century France describes an executioner who was found keeping the severed heads of criminals as paperweights. Another in Germany was accused of selling amulets made from fragments of hangman's rope, said to bring luck, or perhaps just irony. In London, the city's official executioner in the 1600s, Jack Ketch, became so notorious for botching beheadings that his name entered folklore. But when there were no hangings scheduled, Ketch supposedly performed puppet shows. Imagine that! One day you're decapitating traitors on Tower Hill, and the next you're entertaining children with wooden dolls. The same hands, different kind of audience. Executioners also had a hand in maintaining the instruments of justice. When there were no criminals to hang, they were responsible for repairing the gallows, sharpening blades, and maintaining the wheel. They even cleaned up after executions, collecting the bodies, sometimes burying them, sometimes leaving them on display if the sentence required it. But again, this meant handling corpses, blood, and disease, all things the average medieval person wanted nothing to do with. So the executioner became the town's unofficial mortician, pathologist, and garbage collector, all rolled into one deeply unpopular figure. If a plague struck, they were often sent to dispose of the bodies. If a suicide occurred, which was considered a sin and denied church burial, the executioner would handle that too. Because even in death, someone had to do the work. There's a curious irony in how they were treated. They embodied death, but they also preserved life. They cleaned the streets, removed contagion, healed wounds, and ensured justice functioned smoothly. Yet they were never invited to dinner. Even their children inherited the stigma. In some towns, the executioner's family had to sit on a separate bench in church. In others, they were forbidden from touching public fountains, lest they pollute the water. It wasn't uncommon for their sons to marry the daughters of other executioners, not out of romance, but because no one else would have them, which, as you can imagine, made for some very small family reunions. On rare occasions, though, they became minor celebrities. Audiences would cheer a particularly skilled executioner who managed to behead a criminal in one clean stroke. The best ones had reputations, even fan followings. In a world that loved spectacle, the man who provided it could briefly become a star. Of course, that adoration ended the moment the scaffold was taken down. Then it was back to the slaughterhouse, or the tanner's yard, or the lonely cottage beyond the walls. So, what did executioners do when there were no executions? They stitched, boiled, buried, mended, brewed, and waited. They existed in a strange rhythm. brief moments of violence punctuating long stretches, of quiet tedium. It was a job that demanded patience as much as precision. The executioner's life was built on stillness, days, weeks, sometimes months without an event. Then a single morning of tension, the crowd gathering, the drums beating, and afterward, silence again. The town would feast, gossip, and move on, and the man who'd made it all possible would go home to clean his tools and feed his chickens. It's easy, centuries later, to picture them as monsters, but when you look closely, most executioners weren't cruel, just resigned. They were part of a system so convinced of its righteousness that it needed someone to do the killing on its behalf. How did medieval people get divorced without actually divorcing? Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a world where marriage wasn't something you could simply end, where "till death do us part" wasn't just a poetic phrase. It was a contractual trap, sealed by God and enforced by everyone from your priest to your in-laws. So, what happened when medieval people realized that they'd made a terrible mistake? When the saintly husband turned out to be a violent drunk, or the pious wife spent most of her days throwing things at the servants? Well, that's what we're exploring tonight. How medieval people got divorced, without actually divorcing. Because in an age where the church ruled over love, law, and everything in between, there was no quick way out, but that didn't stop people from trying. They just got creative. So, fluff your pillow. Let your mind slow down. And imagine yourself in a candlelit hall somewhere in the 13th century. There's a tapestry of saints on the wall. Your spouse is glaring across the table. And the priest insists this is all perfectly normal. Let's begin. Now, technically, divorce, as we understand it, didn't exist for most medieval Christians. You could get a separation, yes, or an annulment, but an actual legal divorce, allowing you to remarry while your spouse still walked the earth, that was basically heresy. Marriage wasn't a contract between two people. It was a sacrament, like baptism or confession. You could no more undo it than you could unbaptize yourself, which, as you can imagine, caused a lot of problems for people who discovered that their marital bliss was less than blissful. So, they found loopholes. Dozens of them, tiny cracks in canon law that, if pulled just right, might open enough space to squeeze through. Let's start with the most popular option, annulment. An annulment wasn't a divorce. It didn't end a marriage. It declared that the marriage had never technically existed in the first place. You and your spouse hadn't divorced. You had simply made a clerical error in reality. Now, to qualify, you had to prove that something essential had been missing from the start. Usually one of the following. You were related. You hadn't freely consented. The marriage hadn't been consummated. These sound straightforward, but medieval canon lawyers could stretch these ideas into full-blown works of creative fiction. Let's take consanguinity. For example, being related by blood. The medieval church had a remarkably flexible definition of two related. At one point, it was forbidden to marry anyone within 7 degrees of kinship, which, when you do the math, ruled out practically the entire European nobility, which was handy. Actually, because if you ever regretted your marriage, you could just pull out the family tree and say, "Ah, see? Turns out we share a great-great-great-grandmother." Oops! A built-in escape hatch. This was particularly useful among royals, who had a suspicious habit of discovering these forgotten cousins right around the time they wanted a new political alliance, or a younger wife. One famous case involved Louis VII of France and Eleanor of Aquitaine in the 12th century. They'd been married for 15 years. They had 2 daughters, which in royal terms meant no sons, and therefore failure. Louis was pious, solemn, and reportedly not much fun. Eleanor was brilliant, ambitious, and probably quite tired of being married to someone who treated intimacy as a kind of penance. When Louis returned from the Second Crusade, a campaign that went so badly that it probably ruined several marriages, the royal couple decided they'd had enough of each other, so they applied for an annulment. The official reason? They were too closely related. Never mind that the Pope himself had approved their marriage years earlier. Apparently, someone had just noticed they shared a distant ancestor. The annulment went through. Eleanor promptly married Henry Plantagenet, soon to be Henry II of England. Louis remarried, and finally had a son. So everyone got what they wanted, except the church, which suddenly realized annulments might be being used creatively. But what if you weren't lucky enough to be royal, or related to half of Europe? What if you were a merchant's wife in York, or a farmer in Burgundy, and you just wanted your husband to stop snoring and start paying for food? Well, then you had to get inventive. One option was separation from bed and board. This meant you and your spouse were still technically married, but you didn't have to live together. You couldn't remarry, but you also didn't have to share a roof or a bed. Think of it as the medieval version of "we're on a break." You still had to go through church court to get it, and you needed a reason that sounded respectable. Cruelty, abandonment, adultery, or the ever-popular spiritual incompatibility. But even when granted, it didn't free you entirely. You couldn't remarry. You couldn't sleep with anyone else. And if your spouse showed up at your door asking to reconcile, you were expected to give it a go. In other words, you were free, in theory, but only in the way a bird is free inside a slightly larger cage. Then there were the informal methods, and these, frankly, are where things get entertaining. Some couples staged mock divorces in local taverns, complete with witnesses, symbolic acts, and legal-sounding declarations. One 14th century English record describes a husband and wife who literally performed a public parting, dividing their property in half and swearing never to share bread again. It wasn't legal, of course, but in small communities, social recognition sometimes mattered more than law. If everyone agreed you were done, that was that. No priest required. Others went further. Some couples simply pretended the marriage had never happened. If they moved far enough away, say, one town over, and changed their story, who was going to check? There was no national registry, no identification papers, just word of mouth and, occasionally, an inconvenient neighbor with a good memory. And in a world where mortality was high, time itself could be an ally. If your spouse had been gone long enough, presumed dead, you could quietly remarry. Though the church always warned that this was risky, there were endless moral pamphlets about men returning from war to find their wives remarried and confused. Of course, if you really wanted to make things official, there was one more route: the convent. If you could persuade your spouse to join a monastery or convent, the marriage was effectively over. They'd be spiritually dead, leaving you technically single again. This sounds absurd, but it happened surprisingly often. Sometimes it was even done voluntarily, as a kind of pious midlife crisis. Nobles who were tired of worldly life might retire to a monastery, conveniently freeing their spouse to remarry for political reasons. It was the church's version of a no-fault divorce, provided you were willing to spend the rest of your life praying. Now, not all of these strategies were peaceful, because, as we might expect, not every unhappy spouse waited for permission. Records from medieval England and France are full of cases where wives simply ran away. Desertion was technically illegal, but in practice, if you vanished into a distant town or remarried quietly, there wasn't much your ex could do, unless he was wealthy enough to chase you through multiple jurisdictions. The church, naturally, disapproved. It spent centuries issuing increasingly stern warnings about wandering wives and bigamous husbands. But enforcement was difficult, after all. In a world where communication moved at the speed of a horse, by the time the priest heard about your scandal, you were probably 3 villages away and remarried to someone named John, who thought your name was Alice. Of course, for the rich and powerful, things were far more theatrical. When kings and queens wanted out of a marriage, it became a matter of international politics, and sometimes war. Take Henry VIII, the man who famously redefined divorce by inventing an entirely new church just so he could have one. He's the most famous example. But he wasn't the first monarch to struggle with marital law. He was just the loudest. Before him, kings like Philip II of France had already tried to cast off their wives using every loophole available. Philip's marriage to Ingeborg of Denmark lasted one day before he declared it invalid. He claimed they were related, of course, and tried to have her sent back home, but Ingeborg refused. She appealed directly to the Pope, who sided with her, leaving Philip awkwardly excommunicated and still technically married. It took years and several failed remarriages before the church finally let him off the hook. By then, everyone was tired, confused, and probably regretting ever getting involved. It's strange, really. For all the Church's emphasis on permanence, medieval Europe was filled with people who found ways to bend the rules. They weren't rebelling, exactly. Just negotiating, working within the system, finding the edges, seeing how far they could stretch without breaking. And maybe that's what makes this topic so quietly human. Because for all the pomp and theology, at the heart of it were ordinary people. Miserable, hopeful, sometimes ridiculous. Trying to fix the same problem that's been around since time began. Being stuck with the wrong person. Let's drift now from France and England to somewhere a little more austere. The medieval monasteries of Germany and Italy, where scholars were busy debating the theology of marriage itself. Because when priests and canon lawyers got involved, things got even stranger when the crown went cold. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a quieter kind of tragedy. Not the grand, bloody kind. No guillotines, no revolutions, no shouts in the streets. This one's quieter, softer. The kind of heartbreak that happens behind heavy curtains after the candles have gone out and the crown is resting on someone else's head. Tonight, we're talking about what happened to royal mistresses when the king died. Now, being a royal mistress was not exactly a stable career path. There were no pensions, no formal title that could guarantee your comfort. You were, essentially, a luxury accessory with a heartbeat, adored in public, whispered about in private, and discarded the moment your beauty faded, or your protector stopped breathing. Still, many of these women managed to live glittering, gilded lives. They had palaces, jewels, and personal chapels. Some even received official titles like Duchess of this or Marquise of that, as though the title could disguise the fact that their only qualification was, well, proximity. But then, inevitably, the music stopped. The king's heart, usually swollen with gout, wine, and self-importance, gave out. And the mistress, who had spent years as the most envied woman in the realm, suddenly found herself facing an uncomfortable question. What happens now? Let's dim the lights, settle in, and wander through a few centuries of royal heartbreak, where love, politics, and sheer survival collided in slow motion. We'll start, appropriately, in France. Because if there was ever a country that treated royal mistresses like official political appointments, it was France. They even had a term for it, maîtresse en titre, the chief mistress, as though the other mistresses were junior staff. And among them, none was more famous than Madame de Pompadour. She was born Jeanne Antoinette Poisson, which is, yes, literally, Miss Fish. A rather unfortunate surname for someone destined to swim with sharks. But she was clever, graceful, and astonishingly determined. By her mid-20s, she had charmed her way into the heart of King Louis XIII, who was, let's say, not known for restraint. Louis XIV collected mistresses the way other men collected clocks. But Pompadour was different. She wasn't just beautiful. She was interesting. She read philosophy, loved theater, and knew how to make the king feel smart, which, in many courts, was the most seductive quality of all. For 20 years, she ruled the royal court as effectively as a queen, despite not being one. She chose ministers. She hosted salons. She even picked the upholstery for Versailles. And everyone who mattered bowed to her, until she died, still in the king's favor. So, what happened when the king died? Well, for Pompadour, nothing, because she had already gone first, which, in some ways, was merciful. Had she lived longer, she would have likely watched her entire world dissolve overnight, because when Louis XV himself died, his next mistress, Madame du Barry, didn't fare quite so well. Du Barry was the classic story of a common girl who climbed too high. Born poor, possibly even working as a courtesan in her youth, she eventually caught the king's wandering eye. Louis was nearly 60. She was in her early 20s. You can imagine the gossip. Actually, you don't have to imagine it. It was written down extensively. Du Barry became the glittering ornament of Versailles, drowning in diamonds and resentment. The queen despised her. The courtiers mocked her accent. But the king adored her, and that was what mattered. Until 1774, when he died suddenly of smallpox. Almost instantly, the entire court turned on her. Within hours, she was expelled from Versailles, not even allowed to pack properly. The servants who had once curtsied now refused to look at her. Her lavish apartments were sealed off, her jewels confiscated. She was eventually sent to a convent, which is how most former mistresses ended up. A quiet, socially acceptable exile. It was less about religion and more about containment, a way to tuck away the embarrassment of a living reminder of the old king's indulgence. Years later, Du Barry was released and lived quietly on her estate, until the French Revolution came for her too. She tried to charm the revolutionaries. It had always worked before, but apparently revolutionary tribunals were harder to flirt with. She was guillotined in 1793, wearing pearls naturally, and thus ended one of the last official maîtresse en titre roles in Europe. Let's drift a bit north, to England, where royal mistresses were never quite so officially acknowledged, but equally powerful in practice. There's something rather British about how they handled it. A mix of moral outrage and hypocritical indulgence. No one approved of the king having mistresses, but everyone accepted that he would. One of the most famous was Barbara Palmer, Countess of Castlemaine, mistress to Charles II in the late 1600s. Charles, who had spent his youth in exile and poverty during the English Civil War, came back to power with a motto that might as well have been, "Make up for lost time." He had mistresses everywhere. But Barbara was the one who truly dominated his court. She was beautiful, loud, and spectacularly rude. People said she could curse better than a sailor, and spent half her day throwing tantrums about furniture or jewels. And yet, Charles adored her. He gave her titles, money, and 6 children. When he died in 1685, Barbara adapted. She had enough wealth and land to live independently, which was rare. She remarried, very inconveniently for her adult children, and lived into her late 60s, having outlasted almost everyone who had once sneered at her. She ended her days quietly in privacy, though not poverty, which, in this field, counts as a happy ending. Not all were so lucky. Charles II's later mistress, Louise de Keroualle, fared worse. She was a French noblewoman, which made her immediately unpopular in England. She was accused of being a spy, a traitor, and worse, foreign. Still, Charles liked her, and she stayed at court for years. When he died, though, her life collapsed in slow motion. Her income dried up, her debts grew, and she spent decades begging successive monarchs for support. By the time she died, she had become a recluse, living in near poverty in France. Her only consolation was her son, the Duke of Richmond, who carried on her title line. So, in the end, the mistress's bloodline outlasted the king's. A quiet irony, perfectly English in tone. Across Europe, royal mistresses faced the same problem. Their power came entirely from the king's affection, and affection is, historically speaking, a terrible source of job security. Sometimes the queen herself took revenge. Sometimes the new king, often the old one's son, couldn't stand the sight of his father's mistress. And sometimes the public simply turned cruel. Take, for instance, Catherine Dolgorukova, mistress and eventually morganatic wife of Tsar Alexander II. Second of Russia. Alexander had reigned for decades, earning the nickname the Tsar Liberator for freeing the serfs. But his love life was considerably less noble. He met Catherine when she was 16, and he was in his late 40s. The relationship scandalized the Russian court, but Alexander didn't care. When his wife, Empress Maria Alexandrovna, died, he married Catherine in secret, though she was never allowed to be called Empress. When Alexander was assassinated in 1881, Catherine's position became immediately perilous. The new Tsar, Alexander III, her stepson, despised her. Within days, she was ordered to leave the palace. She was given a pension, yes, but forced to live abroad, quietly and alone. She outlived her lover by more than 40 years, wandering from one European city to another, never truly belonging anywhere again. And then there were the ones who simply vanished. Mistresses who had been whispered about endlessly while alive, then erased from the record as though they'd never existed. Their portraits burned, their letters confiscated, their names omitted from official histories. This wasn't always out of cruelty. Sometimes it was strategic. New monarchs preferred a fresh moral start, and nothing says new era like pretending your father's string of lovers didn't exist. It's easy to romanticize these women, the jewels, the silks, the candle-lit rooms, but beneath the luxury was constant anxiety. They were tolerated, not respected, and the moment the king's health faltered, the courtiers would begin calculating how best to distance themselves from her. You could almost hear the shuffling of silk slippers as everyone subtly changed allegiance. Imagine the silence of those palace rooms after the king's death. The servants avoiding eye contact. The guards stationed outside, not for protection, but to make sure you didn't try to take anything on your way out. It wasn't just the end of a relationship. It was social annihilation. Some, though, prepared for it. The clever ones invested quietly, made allies, and arranged marriages. Mistresses who survived royal transitions usually did so because they were pragmatic, not sentimental. Take Agnes Sorel, mistress of Charles VII of France in the 15th century. She was considered the first officially recognized royal mistress, a pioneer of sorts. Beautiful, yes, but also politically savvy. She used her influence to secure estates and titles, ensuring her children would inherit wealth, not just gossip. When she died young, probably poisoned, she had already set the template for generations of women who would follow in her precarious footsteps. Let's drift now to the next era, where royal mistresses became political weapons, courtiers in their own right, and, occasionally, the ones doing the discarding.